It's Searching for Answers, and welcome back. We're glad you're joining us again as we look at 1st and 2nd Timothy together now in combination. We invite you to get your Bible and find those two letters in the New Testament, and we're going to pick up on some themes that we find woven through those two chapters. So we're not working verse by verse this time, but a little bit more thematically. Dr. Katie Ko, La Sierra University, Pastor Ji Yong Lee, pastor and doctoral student at La Sierra University, Professor Dr. Leo Ranzelin in New Testament Studies at Loma Linda University, and Dean of the School of Religion there. My name is John Jones at La Sierra University. So grab your Bible and we'll roll up our sleeves and get into some interesting things here. As you look with us at 1st and 2nd Timothy, and as we've gone over these two letters together, we have found Paul advising Timothy wisely and helpfully and carefully, particularly with reference to various people groups within the congregation, the elderly, the younger, the male, the female. How do they all fit in? What are their respective roles within society at large and within the congregation in particular? We find that Paul has, reflecting upon the spirit of the age, been somewhat concerned that Christianity not be misunderstood as one of the various cults in that Roman Empire, which sometimes were instances of dissolute or licentious living, ways in which people were not very exemplary in society, and sometimes sexual misbehavior was involved. And so there was already a built-in, I think, suspicion, a kind of a built-in concern in some of these mystery religions of the day that they could be kinds of dens of iniquity in some way. Mm-hmm. And so Paul is concerned that there's not be any misunderstanding within Christianity. There are various good reasons for that. First of all, not to misrepresent the name of Christ, but also lest these groups look like some kind of riffraff who were disposable people, easy to throw them to the lions. Mm-hmm. But if you have pillars of society who are upright and respected, a Roman magistrate would be slow to condemn them to martyrdom or punishment or whatever. And so it's a matter, in part, of a survival mechanism. It's primarily a matter of upholding the name of Christ and not misrepresenting the Christian message in the society at large. Given all of that, Paul is particularly concerned for the sisters, that they not be seen as wasting time or somehow spending their time in gossip or running around telling what he calls foolish old stories of various kinds. Paul wants Timothy to help all of the church members, but particularly the female members, to think of themselves highly and conduct themselves in a pure and respectable way. Now, given that, he says some rather judgmental things, and he restricts the pathways open to women somewhat, but we need to uphold a memory, a corporate memory in the church, that there were options within the church that were fully respectable for men and women both. And so, alongside Timothy, these two letters to him, there are other memories and souvenirs of early Christian experience that shine a little bit different light on these questions. And so, by way of contrast, there are collections of narratives that did get written down in the 2nd century after Jesus' life, but which somehow open up other pathways a bit and shine a little different picture on it. These are often stories that involve Paul as well, at least a corporate memory of his life, ministry, and evangelism and his work. And so we find that it's possible to pick up here and there some little threads of memory in the early church. And so I invite you to stay with us as we unpack one or two of these, simply as other examples of potential pathways for women within the Roman Empire and within the Christian congregations as well. One of these is a story that takes off from Paul's ministry in one of the Roman port cities in what we call Turkey today, Asia Minor, called Iconium. And Paul is passing through and taking some time there to conduct an evangelistic series, which has some impact, apparently, upon the people. Katie, do you want to pick up some threads of the corporate memory of that a little bit, and some ways in which the church recalls how that cooked out into people's lives that time?
Absolutely. So what we know of the story that I'm about to relay comes from in a book that's considered by the Christian church to be Apocrypha.
Yeah, it's not in our Bibles.
It's not in our Bibles. It's part of the Acts of Paul and Thecla. And scholars have looked at this book quite carefully and noticed that the way that the stories are told within it are similar to oral traditions of the time period. So there's some evidence to show that the story, even though it was written down between 150 and 190 AD, that it had been passed around the Christian community for quite a long time prior to this. And Thecla is a young woman living in Iconium. She hears about Paul's ministry and message, and she's won over to the gospel. She's engaged to a powerful man at the time, and he's upset because she does not want to marry him. She wants to dedicate herself to ministry, to following Paul, following along with him and ministering, and she wants to devote her chastity to the church as well.
Yeah, she falls in love, but not with Paul.
Yes. No, she falls in love with the gospel.
That's right. She falls in love with Jesus.
And her fiancé is upset about this, and there's this series of incidents that occur in her life where she's endangered as a result with the Roman authorities for breaking this engagement. And then later, when another man falls in love with her and she rebuffs him again, she rebuffs him, she's again kind of thrown to the authorities to be dealt with. And this is where the story gets a little bit tricky, because there are miraculous happenings that supposedly occur that deal with animals. She's saved from lions. The lions do not eat her, that she's thrown to. She's saved from seals that she's thrown to as well. So this is a martyr story, but the story of a could-be martyr, as it were. And she manages to escape and goes about ministering, acting as a minister of the gospel as a result. Now, as I mentioned, this is a book that we don't have enough evidence to say this definitely happened, but we do have enough evidence to say that this was an important tale that was passed around to the early Christian world, and probably inspired and encouraged a lot of people, particularly young women. Maybe gave them an idea of other options out there for them as young women for how they could conduct themselves within their Christian community. And it, in some ways, fits in with other stories that are in our canon, that are in our biblical canon. The stories of Phoebe, for example, and of Junia, and of Lydia, yes, in Macedonia, who's the seller of purple dye, so she's a craftswoman. And Paul is shown, the vision of the man of Macedonia, and he goes, and it's actually this community of women, and she manages to keep the faith and keep that little community going. So Thecla, even though we don't know whether or not she's real, she does serve as this sort of type, this example that women could look up to.
So whether it's all historically or accurate is maybe less important than whether it was at least a story that made sense in some way in the early Christian community, that they could at least say, well, yeah, there are options. And yeah, a woman didn't have a lot of options, did they, in Roman Empire? There were a few.
Right.
One was to get married and stay home and don't even go out of doors, by and large. And that was probably plan A for most women in Roman society. Other options, generally, you could become a priestess, I suppose, in one of the local pagan cults, of course. That was, and in some ways may have opened up an option, not directly across in Christianity, but that women could devote themselves and their lives to this or that or another divinity somehow.
But on the whole, as you say, it was a hierarchical and patriarchal
Yeah,
world.
it really was, wasn't
And
it?
as you said earlier, the Christian church had to be careful not to call into question those
Yeah,
values
not to be
and
misunderstood.
beliefs. And that's why you get in a couple of Paul's letters to live a quiet and peaceful life and be careful of your conduct toward outsiders so as not to give a false and bad impression to the Romans.
Yeah.
Because again, as you said, the Romans were always concerned with these weird, crazy cults that could destabilize society.
They were worried about that.
Yep.
Peace above all. Keep the peace
That's
above
right.
all. So here we have, for example, Paul saying hello to everybody, not when he's in Rome, but elsewhere, but writing a letter to Rome. And in chapter 16, he sends some greetings to some people. That's particularly interesting, isn't it, Leo? You want to pick up on that and share with us something in Romans chapter 16. And we invite our viewers to find Romans 16.
Right.
Yeah.
Please go to Romans 16, and you will see that in that chapter,
This is the last chapter in the letter. Yeah.
Paul lists a number of women that are part of his apostolic ministry.
Right.
And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I believe there's like 9 or 10 and that are listed here that are clearly participating in his apostolic ministry. And then, of course, there's a crucial verse of 16:7, where he refers to Andronicus and Eunia, a woman. My relatives who were in prison with me, they are prominent among the apostles. A reference here to Eunia being an apostle.
An apostle. Yeah, isn't that
So
interesting?
remarkable statement that he makes with respect.
Right.
A woman involved in his ministry.
Prisca and Aquila again.
Yes.
And she's mentioned first, and she's really important.
Yep.
She's been a strong.
And at Philippi, Judea, and Syntyche are key leaders at the church that Paul has to speaks of.
So women could take leadership roles in on a certain level and within certain kind of parameters and norms of the day, it looks like, doesn't it? So here's Thecla. She overcomes. There are times when Roman magistrates just want to be done with her. She's put into situations where martyrdom looks inevitable, and yet her life is saved miraculously. She's pestered by. She apparently was attractive, but when a family, when she agreed to be married, this was not primarily her decision. Her parents promised her to another family. This was a very advantageous contract, apparently. Huh? And so when she breaks the contract and says, no, I don't want to marry this fellow, after all, now that I've fallen in love with Jesus, both families are upset, but the magistrate is too, because civil society has no place for breach of contract like this. And so it's a serious problem.
Especially on the part of a woman.
Especially on the part of a woman. That's right, yeah. So this is a big deal. And yet, eventually, she goes through all of these trials and desperate situations without ever forgetting Jesus. It's Jesus whom she lives for. And she and Paul each continue on evangelistic travels and missions. They cross paths periodically here and there in various places. They are not, however, traveling together. It's very clear. She's a virgin all her life. Mm-hmm. And so the self-dedication involves a completely abstinent life. It's an ascetic life. It's marked by a great deal of self-sacrifice. If you're going to choose that path, you know that you are surrendering much in your life, of comfort, of respect, and so forth. But within Christianity, there is a very high regard for her. And as she ages on through the rest of her life, the regard and respect among Christians grows, and she is upheld with a great deal of esteem. It seems to me what we have is a kind of a two-step, three-step thing. The memories of the life of Jesus are of Jesus being very understanding and accommodating to women. There are a number of stories. He is consistently supportive of them in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but also in John, who tells different stories, but nonetheless, there's that pattern. Eventually, as the gospel spills out of Judaism into the larger Gentile world, the restrictions that are placed on women in the Gentile world pose a problem, and we do see some rather strong admonitions that women should know their place and stay in it, and womankind must always be under some male headship. If not father, then husband. If not husband, then elder son. You know, that's there. There is a concern that the gospel not be misunderstood. And so this is part of the larger picture simply of public respectability and decency. That's what that's all about. As she grows in her fame and her ministry, Christians come to respect her more and more as the years go by. She becomes remembered eventually, after her life is over, as a saint, as a very highly respected person. And so we have women honored by Jesus, women increasingly controlled in the early church, but always with that exception of the occasional woman who conducts business in her own name, models Christ in her own name, and is a strong asset to the church. Paul works with those people very respectfully.
And I think it's really easy to kind of jump on and emphasize the restrictions that are placed on women, and then to take those and to tell women, you know, Paul says you can't do this, this, and this. But when you take it within the context of the time period, Christianity is actually being much more open to women and to what they can do and how much control they have over their spiritual lives and their wider lives and their behavior than is acceptable within the Roman community. So we're seeing Christianity as actually being, from a modern perspective, being more progressive than the secular society at the time when it comes to gender roles and
I think it was more progressive.
It was.
Just because of the kinds of women whose names we have encountered here. As we read the text today, now we find ourselves asking again, what did the text mean? What does it mean? What do we take over into our culture and society as Christians? And what do we realize that we're conditioned by time, place, circumstance, and culture, which we today may need to apply in new ways differently in our society today? That's the lingering question for all of us, our viewers, and for us. What shall we say?
Well, first of all, I think that we should respect all roles as being equally valuable. One of the things that is difficult as a historian is that women are not always in the historical narrative, and it's not because they weren't doing important things, but they weren't doing things that were considered important by the society. And so I think that when we look at women within church, when we look at men within our church communities, that we honor and respect whatever role it is that God has called them to. And we give value to whatever that is, whether it's acting as a servant of the church or it's acting as a servant of the people around them, the community around them. I think that that's important. The Marys and the Marthas are both important to our communities within the church.
Yeah, good. That's important.
The other thing I think it's important to underscore, Dr. Jones, and that is you've got to read the totality of passages that refer to the role of women in the life of the church.
Rather than pulling one out by
Exactly. And when you do so, I am of the opinion that you have what I call intracanonical tensions.
Yes.
You've got texts that clearly seem to resonate with the culture of the time and the way women were treated in this hierarchical and patriarchal world. And yet you have other texts that I think move in a direction of what I would call an egalitarianism. And of course, the most famous passage that we do need to say is the one we find in Galatians 3:28, right? Which we should read, where Paul does say, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. A remarkable passage.
And that is a visionary passage.
Indeed. And in that world, it is quite radical and striking.
Yeah, that is very unusual. Yeah. And yet, that made it into the canon, didn't it? Yeah. Ji-young.
Yes, sir. So this is very difficult, isn't it?
Yes.
We would not be doing our jobs if we pretended that we have even an answer, I think. And as I've been listening to my colleagues, all of you speak tonight, I'm suddenly finding myself holding back tears right now because, you know, the story of Thekla, fascinating. I urge all of our readers at least to be acquainted with it, to be able to say that you're an educated Christian. Because the story was real, as Katie and Dr. Jones, you were mentioning before. We don't know how much of it happened. We don't know if Alexander really kissed her on the street, or if one of the shocking points in this story, if her mother truly asked her to be burned at the stake. That actually seems pretty plausible because in that time, the mother would have relied on her daughter's marriage to have her sustenance in her old years, right?
Right.
So when Thekla decided not to marry, period, let alone not to marry this huge, what to our days would be more like a governor, magistrate, the mother would have lost her life basically. And Thekla faced that and still chose Christ, what she believed to be the gospel. And all the stories like Thekla, plus the problematic passages in 1st and 2nd Timothy about women needing to be silent and to learn in obedience and submission. I'm a woman, obviously. I'm a minister. I'm a chaplain. I've dedicated my life to sharing the gospel, and I struggle with this. I have to say, I cannot say that, oh, it makes sense to me, or I'm okay with that, but I still love this word. And as we've been struggling with the Thekla story in the context of 1st and 2nd Timothy, as we're wrapping up, the only way I could stay sane in this quest by myself was just to put it in the big picture.
Yeah.
Crucifixion happened AD 30 to 33, about 30 years after that Paul dies. Yeah. And then this is a very turbulent time, a contentious time where the Bible wasn't even canonized yet.
Yeah, right.
And what it meant to be Christian, what Christianity wasn't even clear to everyone. And I would like to challenge myself, my colleagues, and all of our viewers to ask how much correctness matters for faith, for their faith. we must, whatever our stance on the literal inspiration or non-literal inspiration of the Bible may be, wherever we may stand on that issue, we still have to say humans had a huge part in canonizing and bringing this into our hands today.
Yeah.
And if Paul really said what he did, does that shake your faith?
Yeah.
If Thecla's story is true or not, does that shake your faith? And going even further, what's important to me now as a woman is actually not the woman's issue, because if we succeed in beating this women's issue, then we have other
We do. It's bigger than just that.
other
isn't it?
populations that we were ignoring.
Yeah.
And I think it all comes down to what is our role. And my favorite verse in all of 1st and 2nd Timothy, I think it all comes down to this, is 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 17. I think Dr. Ransel, in our last episode, you mentioned something about this verse too, but this to me, I've been struggling to find the one verse that to me summarizes the whole 1st and 2nd Timothy, including the women's issue, is 17, chapter 4, verse 17. But the Lord stood by me and gave me strength. Not just anyone, but the Lord gave me strength. And then there's the reason. It would be good enough just to receive strength from the Lord, but the reason the Lord stood by Paul and all of us, stands by all of us and gives us strength, is so that through me, meaning Paul and Timothy and me and all of us, the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it.
So there's the real criterion.
Yes, yes. So to me, as a female minister, it's less important to me what Paul meant than the fact that the Lord is standing by me. And someday it'll all be clear. But we keep searching for answers. Right? We don't give up either.
Yeah, that is true.
Because the point isn't.
Well, why don't you round this off for us
Well-
entirely, Katie? Take the last minute here to sum up.
And I think that was a beautiful thing that you said. We're not supposed to seek power or authority. We're to seek God's will for our life and our calling. God is with us, and we're supposed to love Him. We're supposed to be in relationship with Him. Relationship is an important theme throughout 1st and 2nd Timothy.
Yes.
The relationship that Paul has with his Lord, the relationship that Paul has with Timothy, Timothy has with his church members. So,
And Timothy with Paul.
absolutely, absolutely. So we're supposed to seek relationship with God and relationship with those around us. And when we feel gratitude for the grace that's been extended to us, we want to share that with those around us. And I think that's really the basis of ministry, is you found something so good and you want to give it to those around you. And I think that if that's our focus rather than looking for or viewing others as seeking authority or power, it becomes a different conversation.
Yes, and rightly so. So there is the criterion, the relational considerations. We're glad you've been with us through this. Stay with us next time as we look again at the Bible, searching for answers.